Welcome to the Deep Dive, brought to you by IrishArchaeology.org.
Great to be here.
Today, we're diving deep into Ireland's Neolithic period. That's roughly 4000 BC to 2500 BC.
A truly transformative time.
Absolutely. And while those iconic stone tombs often grab the headlines, we're going to focus on something, well, maybe more fundamental.
Their homes.
Exactly. Their homes and hearths. We want to get a feel for the everyday lives of these first farmers.
How they built their houses, lived in them, what they ate, the crafts they developed.
How their communities formed. Really try to uncover the ingenuity of their domestic world.
It's fascinating stuff because this wasn't just a minor change. The Neolithic arrival, it was a comprehensive revolution.
Revolution, in what sense?
It brought entirely new ideologies, new technologies.
Okay.
Think agriculture, animal husbandry, cattle, sheep, pigs arriving, plus pottery, those polished stone axes.
Wow, okay, so a complete package, almost.
Pretty much. A fundamentally different way of life compared to the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who came before.
But this Neolithic package, did it just land fully formed? Or was it more complicated?
Oh, much more complicated. Definitely not uniform or instant. There was interaction, cultural exchange with the existing Mesolithic people.
How do we know that?
Well, for instance, isotopic analysis that's looking at the chemical signatures in bones from places like Ballynagilly.
Right, the famous portal tomb.
Exactly. The early Neolithic burials there show diets quite similar, surprisingly, to some Mesolithic individuals, mainly land-based food.
So maybe a gradual shift in diet, or Mesolithic people joining these new communities.
It could be either or both. And then you have sites like Tankardstown showing continuous occupation right through the transition. So not a simple replacement, more like adoption, adaptation. It varied place by place.
Okay, so the timeline, 4000 to 2500 BC is the broad sweep, but the very beginning is a bit fuzzy.
Yeah, that first bit, maybe 4000 to 3750 BC, the uncertain beginnings, it's archaeologically less clear. We have those early monuments like Ballynagilly starting maybe 3800 BC.
For widespread farming and houses.
Potentially, yes. It suggests maybe the ideas, the ideology, perhaps linked to monument building, might have arrived slightly ahead of the full farming package and the substantial timber houses we associate with the settled life.
Which brings us to the house horizon.
Precisely. Early Neolithic II, roughly 3750 to 3600 BC. That's when we see much clearer evidence for farming communities settling down.
And building these rectangular timber houses.
Yes, that's the key marker. Permanent settlements, those specific houses. A much more visible archaeological footprint.
These rectangular houses, they sound quite distinctive. Were they common?
They were defining, certainly for that specific period, even if relatively short-lived. We found evidence for about 80 of them across maybe 50 sites.
And concentrated in time.
Very much so. Mostly between about 3720 and 3620 BC. A century or so, really.
Just a century. That's interesting.
It is. Their widespread appearance in that window suggests it was a key part of this new cultural package, spreading rapidly with farming, a real symbol of putting down roots.
Building one must have been a major undertaking.
Oh, absolutely. A significant investment in labor and resources. It shows a real commitment to a specific place.
So how do they actually build them? What does the archaeology tell us?
Our main clue comes from the foundation trenches. They dug these quite substantial slots to outline the house.
Like at Russellstown.
Yes, Russellstown and Carlow is a good example. The trench there was U-shaped, over half a meter wide, sometimes nearly a meter wide, and dug, maybe 30 centimeters to nearly a meter deep in places.
That's serious digging. What went into the trenches?
Two main techniques, it seems. One is post and plank. They'd set upright posts and vertical planks, often oak, we know, from Ballynagilly into the trench.
And secured them how?
With packing stones wedged around the base. We see that at Russellstown and Tankardstown. We even found burnt remains of planks at Russellstown, clearly showing vertical sides and a flat base.
Okay, post and plank. What was the other method?
Wattle and daub. Less substantial, maybe? At Butcherstown, also in Carlow, the trench was shallower, not as wide, and lacked those big packing stones.
So a different structure.
Yeah, the thinking is they set posts in post holes at the base of the trench, then wove branches, that's the wattle between them. Then they'd plaster it all over with daub.
Daub, like mud and straw.
Exactly. Clay, straw, maybe dung mixed in, a lighter construction overall.
And the roof, holding it all up.
Often the walls themselves seem to have been load-bearing, but they frequently added internal posts for extra support.
Like a central ridgeline.
Sometimes, yes. Russellstown had a line of posts down the middle. Mananny-Housey even had posts inside and just outside the walls, suggesting a really heavy roof structure.
And what was the roof made of?
thatch. That's the most likely scenario. Reeds, straw, whatever was available locally. Direct evidence is rare, as you'd expect, but thatch fits the bill.
What about the size of these houses? Was there a standard size?
There seems to have been a common range, yes, typically around 6 to 8 meters long and 4 to 7 meters wide.
So decent-sized rooms.
Definitely livable spaces, but we do find larger ones too, some reaching 9 to 11 meters long. Ballynagilly is a big one, about 13.5 by 8 meters on the outside.
That's quite substantial.
It is, and some had slightly curved end walls, adding a bit of variation. Ballynagilly was about 6.5 by 6 meters, Russellstown 8.5 by 6, Busherstown 8.4 by 6.4. Tankardstown South 2 was huge, maybe 15.5 meters long.
Quite a range then, despite the general template.
Exactly. It probably reflects different household sizes, maybe status, or just local variations over time.
And did they orient them in particular ways, pointing north or south?
Often, yes. We see alignments like north, northeast to south-southwest at Russellstown, or simply east-west, northwest, southeast.
Why? Sunlight, shelter.
Likely a mix of practical reasons catching the sun, sheltering from wind, but maybe symbolic ones too, aligning with the landscape, or perhaps even the sun or stars. Cosmological reasons can't be ruled out.
Let's step inside metaphorically. What was the internal layout like? Hearths.
Hearths are very common, usually central. You find them as patches of burnt, oxidized clay, charcoal concentrations, clear signs of fire.
Were they always present?
Mostly. Ballynagilly actually had 2 hearths. Russellstown had a possible one. Busherstown probably had one in the western part. Ballynagilly had a definite central one. Interestingly, Tankardstown South, too, that big one, didn't seem to have a hearth in the main central area, which is curious.
Perhaps a different function for that part of the house. Or maybe it just didn't survive.
Both are possible. Preservation is always an issue.
Did they divide the space up inside, create rooms?
Yes, there's evidence for internal divisions. Alignments of post holes, smaller stake holes, sometimes shallow slots called beam slots.
How would that work?
Well, that central post line at Russellstown might have supported a partition as well as the roof. Busherstown had post and stake hole patterns suggesting divisions. Ballynagilly definitely had 2 rooms separated by a partition wall.
And the hearth was in one room.
In the larger one, yes. The smaller one might have been for storage, perhaps sleeping. Another site, just called House 3, had a clear compartment marked out by beam slots, so they were definitely organizing the internal space.
Where were the doors?
Usually thought to be in the gable ends, or maybe the corners. Russellstown might have had one on the southeast side where the trench ended. Tankardstown South, too, had a definite entrance on the south side and maybe others on the west and east.
And floors. Anything survive?
It's often quite ephemeral, hard to spot. But Tankardstown South, too, did have patches of cobbling and areas of compacted clay that look like deliberate floor surfaces, even a patch of decayed organic material.
What about other features? Pits inside?
Yes, shallow pits turn up inside some houses, like Russellstown and Tankardstown South, too, again. Could be for rubbish, small storage, or maybe holding the base of light wattle screens for further partitioning.
It's striking how similar these houses are across different sites. You mentioned a template.
Yes, Jessica Smith coined that phrase, a commonly held house template. The consistency in construction, size, date, internal features, it really points to a shared cultural understanding of what a house should be. It spread with the farming package.
It wasn't just about shelter, was it? There's a ritual aspect.
Absolutely. This is really fascinating. We often find deliberately placed artifacts in the foundation trenches and post holes.
What sort of things?
Broken pottery, stone tools, arrowheads, axe heads, sometimes pieces of querns, the grinding stones.
Why put them there? Offerings.
That's the interpretation. Ritual offerings. Maybe to consecrate the house, ensure good fortune for the inhabitants, or perhaps honor the earth the house was built on.
So the house was more than just functional.
Definitely. It blurs that line we sometimes draw between the everyday domestic and the sacred or ritual. Gabriel Cooney talks about the connection between these houses for the living and the megalithic tombs, the houses for the dead. It suggests a deep symbolic link in their worldview.
Okay, so they built these houses. How did they actually sustain themselves? Farming was key, you said.
It was the foundation of their economy. Starting around 4000 BC, it gradually replaced the Mesolithic hunter-gatherer strategies. A big part of it was clearing woodland.
For fields and pasture.
Exactly, making space for crops and for their newly introduced domestic animals.
What crops were they growing?
Primarily wheat, especially emmer wheat, triticum, dicum, and barley, both the hulled and naked types. The main evidence kicks in after about 3750 BC.
And we have direct evidence.
Yes, that cache of emmer wheat found burnt inside Tankardstown House 1 is fantastic evidence. Oats and rye were probably around too, but likely just as weeds growing amongst the main crops initially.
And the animals, you mentioned they were introduced.
That's right. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, none were native to Ireland. They had to be brought over, presumably by boat.
Quite an undertaking.
Huge. And cattle especially became incredibly important economically and probably symbolically too. Much later, they even became a unit of currency. Lipid analysis on late Neolithic pottery, grooved ware, shows lots of cattle products being processed.
And dairying, milk.
Yes, we have evidence for milk consumption right back in the early Neolithic from residues inside those carinated bowl pots dating back to the 38th century BC.
So established dairy farming very early on. What about their farming techniques? Were they sophisticated?
The evidence points towards longer-term fixed plot agriculture rather than shifting cultivation. And then you have the side fields in Mayo.
Ah, yes, the famous stone walls.
Incredible system. Dates to around 3700, 3500 BC. Large-scale walled fields, enclosures. It screams communal land management, a big investment, probably heavily focused on cattle.
Were they manuring the fields?
That's a hot topic for research right now, using stable isotope analysis on plant remains and animal bones. But it's likely they understood the need to maintain soil fertility. Still, it wasn't all farming. They were still using wild resources, too.
Right. It was a mixed strategy.
Definitely. Don't picture them abandoning hunting and gathering entirely. Wild plants were still important. Hazelnuts, for example, were found at Russelstown. Fruits, berries.
Like the apple pip at Tankardstown.
Exactly. The first prehistoric one found in Ireland. And they were still hunting. Red deer, which might actually be a Neolithic introduction itself. Hare, birds. The wild was still part of their larder.
What about fish and seafood, being an island?
It's a bit complex, that one. The isotope evidence generally suggests less marine protein in their diet compared to Mesolithic people.
A shift towards the land.
That's the general picture. But we also find large shell middens, piles of oyster shells and other shellfish at coastal sites like Ballynagilly Bay and Strangford Lough.
So they were still using coastal resources.
It seems so. Maybe seasonally or perhaps by specific communities not well represented in the isotope studies we have so far. Interestingly, actual fish bones are very rare at the main early Neolithic II house sites that have been analyzed in detail.
So still some debate there.
Yes, it requires integrating all the different lines of evidence, not straightforward.
Okay, they've got their food farmed and wild. How do they prepare it, cook it, store it?
For processing grains, they used saddle querns, basically two stones rubbed together, though maybe fewer than in some other Neolithic cultures. Dental studies show people were ingesting gritty particles, possibly from the querns.
Flour or porridge?
Good question. There's debate. Were they mainly grinding flour for bread, or boiling whole, or cracked grains into gruel or porridge? Scandinavian parallels suggest boiling was very common, especially once they had pots.
Pottery again. Crucial for cooking.
Absolutely. Allowed boiling, simmering. Stews, porridges become much easier. Lipid analysis confirms they were cooking meat and dairy in the pots. Roasting over the central hearth would still happen, of course.
Any evidence for things like cooking pits? Like the later Philosophiae.
Simpler versions might well have existed. There was a cooking trench found near a later bell beaker site near Ballynagilly, so the idea of pit cooking wasn't unknown.
And storage. With agriculture, you need to store the harvest.
Definitely. Pottery vessels were key. Designated rooms or areas within the house, like maybe that small room at Monaniby pits, both inside and outside houses, were likely used too. And drying the grain after harvest was crucial to stop it spoiling. That might explain some of the charred grains we find. Accidental burning during drying.
Let's talk more about that pottery. You mentioned carinated bowls as the earliest.
Yes, they appear around 6,000 years ago. Handmade using coils of clay, tempered and probably fired in open bonfires. Carinated bowls are the classic early style linked to the house horizon.
Describe them.
Round-bottomed, a sharp angle or carination partway up the body. A curved neck, often quite plain, undecorated. The traditional style is very consistent across Ireland and Britain. Later versions get more regional variation. The Dunmurry style is simpler, maybe very early. We find them at Russelstown, Busherstown, Monani, Tankardstown South, lots of the house sites.
And other styles followed.
Yes, regionally. In the north, you get Lyle's Hill style with angular rims and Ballymarla style without the angular rims, finding that at Ballynagilly helped date the site. There are also Ballyalton bowls, often in court tombs.
What about later Neolithic pottery?
Carrowkeel ware appears in the 3rd millennium BC, associated with passage tombs like Carrowkeel itself. It's thicker, coarser, often heavily decorated. Then there's grooved ware in the late Neolithic, flat-based, often found ritually deposited in pits or near monuments like Noath or timber circles. Lough has its own sequence too, with the Clastera bowls early on.
And beaker pottery at the very end.
Yes, appearing around 2500 BC, marking the transition towards the Bronze Age, often deposited in similar ways to grooved ware.
So pottery wasn't just for cooking.
No, clearly used for storage, serving, but also had symbolic importance being placed in tombs and house foundations. And the different styles might express local identities, connections.
Okay, alongside pottery, stone tools remained vital, didn't they?
Absolutely. Stone was still the primary material for cutting tools, and the polished stone axe is the iconic Neolithic tool.
Where did they get the stone?
Specific rock sources were highly valued. Porcelainite from Tiefboulia and Rathlin Island in Antrim, porphyry from Lambay Island near Dublin, various greenstones.
Making them must have been hard work.
Incredibly labor-intensive, quarrying the stone, roughing it out, then hours and hours of grinding and polishing to get that smooth, sharp edge. It implies specialization.
And they were traded.
Seems likely. An axe found at Thornhill in Derry seems to be made of stone from the Lake District in England. That points to exchange networks.
What were they used for? Just chopping trees?
That was crucial forest clearance, carpentry for the houses. But they clearly had symbolic value, too, given how often they turn up as deliberate deposits in houses, bogs, tombs, prized possessions.
And what about everyday tools? Flint and shirt.
Yes, that was the bread and butter toolkit. Flint and shirt for making leaf-shaped arrowheads, beautiful craftsmanship there, javelin heads, scrapers of all kinds for working hides and wood, knives, even sickle blades for harvesting grain. They continued making bandflakes too, a tool type from the Mesolithic.
Where did they get flint?
Coastal beaches, river gravels had flint pebbles, and the chalk areas, especially Antrim, were rich sources. Ballynagilly had lots of flint tools and waste from making them, many burnt. Tankardstown South, interestingly, had less finished tools but more napping debris.
Wood was obviously vital for houses. Any other uses? Basketry?
Wood was fundamental. Tool handles, fences, maybe even dugout canoes or log boats. They were skilled woodworkers, the joinery in the houses shows that. Coppicing woodland to get straight poles was likely practiced.
And baskets.
Direct evidence is super rare because it decays, but you have to assume basketry was essential for carrying, storing, making traps. We see impressions on later pottery sometimes, and we know Mesolithic people made fish traps, so the skill was likely there throughout.
What about clothes? Textiles? Any evidence for that?
It's pretty scant for the Neolithic, unfortunately. Our earliest solid evidence is actually late Neolithic to spindle whorls.
Spindle whorls. For spinning thread.
Exactly. One from Craigendevansky in Tyrone, another from Ballyalton in Down. They confirm spinning was happening.
What fibers would they use? Flax. Wool?
Most likely flax for linen, and wool once sheep became common. The spindle whorls prove spinning and plying. We also see cord impressions on pottery showing they made twisted cordage.
Any idea about looms?
No direct evidence for Neolithic looms in Ireland. Later on, the vertical warp-weighted loom seems common, but we can't be sure for this period. Bone needles were probably used, as they are found throughout prehistory. So hints of textile production, but not a lot of detail yet.
Okay, let's zoom out again. How are these dwellings arranged? Were people living in isolated houses or villages?
We see a real variety, everything from apparently isolated single homesteads to small clusters of 2 or 3 houses, right up to larger groups that look more like small villages.
Why the difference?
Probably down to local conditions, the landscape, the specific farming strategy they were using, maybe social choices, even defense, and things likely changed over the centuries too.
Can you give examples?
Sure, Monanny and Monaghan had that cluster of 3 big houses close together. Russellstown and Busherstown look more like individual farmsteads, though we don't know the full picture around them.
And the larger settlements.
Thornhill in Derry is fascinating. At least 5 structures inside a palisade, a defensive enclosure. Might have housed 50 people or so. Corbally in Kildare reportedly had 7 houses in 2 groups. And Lough in Limerick. That's a whole landscape, dense with houses and activity over a long time, especially on the Knockadoon Peninsula.
Inside fields imply settlement nearby, too.
Absolutely. Those huge field systems point to organized communities living and working the land together.
Do they favor particular locations for settlements?
Yes, definitely. They liked well-drained soils, often on south or southwest-facing slopes, better for growing crops and warmer. And being near water streams, rivers like the Foyle at Thornhill was crucial. Shows a real understanding of the landscape.
So the house was the core unit. What about the household itself? Family structure.
The house was the center of everything: daily life, economy, raising the next generation. Those internal divisions might hint at developing ideas about private versus shared space, how activities were organized.
And family size.
The range of house sizes, maybe 24 square meters up to over 70 internally, could fit nuclear families or maybe small extended families.
Do burials help? Do we find families buried together?
Not usually in the houses themselves in Neolithic Ireland, which is different from some other places. Those child burials near Knockadune at Lough are very rare. Most Neolithic human remains come from the big communal megalithic tombs.
So the tombs are more about community than individual families.
That's a big part of the thinking now. The concept of kinwork is useful here, the idea that kinship isn't just blood. It's built through shared work, living together, shared rituals like building and using the tombs. It bound households and the wider community.
What about cooperation beyond the household?
Yeah.
Building those big houses or field systems.
Exactly. Projects like the Thornhill Palisade or the side fields needed labor from multiple households working together. It points to developing social structures, community identity.
Were there communal meeting places?
Yes. Things like causewayed enclosures like Magraboy or Donegal Hill and later henges like Ballynagilly are thought to be sites for larger gatherings, social, economic, maybe ritual or defensive.
Yeah.
Places where the wider community came together periodically.
Did life become more specialized? Division of labor.
Likely more so than in the Mesolithic. Farming itself requires scheduling tasks through the year. Craft specialization making pottery, those polished axes suggest some people focused on that, maybe exchanging goods. Evidence for gender roles within the house is hard to pin down archaeologically, though.
Was it an equal society, or were some people becoming wealthier or more important?
Generally, the Neolithic is seen as more egalitarian than the Bronze Age that followed, but there are hints.
Like house size.
Possibly. Those variations in house size at Manani or Tankardstown South could reflect differences in household size, but maybe also wealth or status. Owning more cattle could certainly lead to inequality.
What about the tombs? Weren't they for chiefs or elites?
That was the traditional view. But recent DNA work suggests many people in the tombs were related across the community, not just a single ruling lineage. Again, kinwork and community identity might be more important than strict hierarchy in how tombs were used. The link between status in life, houses, and status in death tombs is still debated.
So settling down created a stronger sense of place.
Very much so. Permanent settlements farming the same land. It leads to placemaking. These locations become centers for the economy, for crafts, social life, identity.
Let's revisit Ballynagilly in Tyrone. What makes it significant?
It's a well-documented early Neolithic farming settlement around 3200 BC, clear evidence of forest clearance, then building that classic rectangular house, 6.5 by 6 meters, plank built using oak.
What did they find inside?
2 hearths, pits, post holes, and importantly, Ballymarla-style pottery, which helped confirm the date. Lots of flint tools, too, leaf arrowheads, scrapers, knives, even axe fragments, many of them burnt.
Any connections to other sites?
Yes, comparisons were made with a nearby tomb, Carnarvon, suggesting links between settlement and monument, and even with house styles from continental Europe, the Lough culture. There was also later beaker activity nearby, but no definite beaker houses.
And Lough in Limerick, that sounds like a Neolithic hub.
It really was. A landscape occupied for millennia, drawn by the fertile land. Knockadune Peninsula is packed with sites. Neolithic houses there were both circular and rectangular, often with stone foundations, probably wattle and daub walls. O'Riordan, Grogan, Eogan, Cleary, many archaeologists have worked there.
Rich in finds, too.
Exceptionally. Lots of pottery, early middle Neolithic soyale bowls, late Neolithic roofed ware, beaker pottery, stone tools, bone tools, ornaments, evidence of ritual like an ox skeleton near a tomb, and those rare domestic child burials. It paints a picture of a thriving, long-lasting agricultural community.
Finally, Tankardstown, also Limerick. What did that tell us?
Tankardstown gave us really clear evidence for those early Neolithic rectangular houses alongside the crops they grew, found during pipeline work.
2 houses you mentioned.
Yes, house 1 was about 7.4 by 6.4 meters, plank built and destroyed by fire. The radiocarbon dates on burnt grain and charcoal place it firmly in the early Neolithic, maybe around 3700, 3600 BC calibrated.
And the grain cache.
Yes, a store of emmer wheat, plus that amazing prehistoric apple pip, direct evidence of their food.
And house too.
Much bigger, more complex, maybe 15.5 by 7.5 meters with annexes. Also post and plank, foundation trench with packing stones, but less intensely burnt than House 1. No clear central hearth survived. Had some cobbling, clay floors, a pit, fewer finished flint tools, more napping waste, and classic carronade ware pottery.
What do the differences tell us?
The size difference suggests variation within the settlement, maybe status, maybe function. And the fire that destroyed House 1 raises questions about how long these houses lasted, how they were abandoned or decommissioned. Maybe fire was sometimes part of the process.
So, pulling it all together, what's the big picture of daily life?
It's a life centered on these permanent timber houses with hearths, sometimes divided spaces, a mixed economy, growing cereals like emmer and barley, raising cattle, sheep, pigs, using dairy but still relying on wild nuts, fruits, and hunting. Fishing, maybe less central than before, but still happening coastally.
How they prepared food.
Grinding grain, cooking in pots boiling, stewing plus roasting. Storing food in pots, pits, maybe dedicated rooms.
Yeah, their crafts.
Making distinctive pottery like carronaded bowls for use and maybe ritual, highly skilled stoneworking for polished axes and flint tools, essential woodworking for houses and everything else, and the beginnings of textile production. Settled life in varied patterns from single farms to larger communities.
And the social side.
The household was the core unit, likely nuclear or small extended families. Community cooperation was vital for big projects like building houses, field systems, monuments. Communal sites suggest wider interaction. Division of labor likely increased. Society was probably fairly egalitarian, but hints of difference emerge in house size, maybe livestock wealth. The tombs reflect community identity, kinwork, as much as elite status, and settling down created this deep connection to place.
It really feels like the Neolithic domestic world laid the groundwork for so much of later Irish history.
Absolutely fundamental. Settled farming, permanent homes, new technologies, more complex communities. It transformed Ireland, created the farmed landscape we see traces of today. And we're still learning more through new science, isotopes, DNA, residue analysis, understanding these households, their communities, their connection to the land. It remains a compelling story. The legacy starts right there in those homes and around those hearths.
It's been fascinating peeling back the layers on Neolithic daily life. Thank you for sharing these insights.
My pleasure. Considering all this evidence we discussed, it really makes you think, doesn't it? What were the actual daily rhythms like for someone living in one of those houses? What did home truly mean to them when their dwelling, their work, and the landscape around them were so deeply intertwined, perhaps in ways we struggle to fully grasp today?